The banquet hall fell silent as the four-star general approached our table, his chest heavy with ribbons and medals that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above. My family sat frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, as this man who commanded respect from presidents and prime ministers walked directly toward me. When he stopped at my chair and extended his hand, asking if he could have my autograph for his daughter, my sister Vivian's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against her plate. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The tension in our Phoenix suburb home was thick enough to cut with a knife that Sunday morning. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching my mother Carmen furiously scrub already spotless countertops, while my father Eduardo sat at the breakfast table, his morning coffee growing cold as he stared at the newspaper without really reading it. My sister Vivian lounged in the living room, scrolling through her phone with the practiced indifference of someone who had never been the source of family disappointment. They were preparing for another family gathering, another opportunity for them to explain away my existence to relatives who would inevitably ask what their youngest daughter was doing with her life. The script was always the same. Carmen would sigh dramatically and mention that I was still playing with computers, while Eduardo would shake his head and mutter something about wasted potential. Vivian, their golden child who had married a successful real estate developer and produced two picture-perfect grandchildren, would simply change the subject to her latest vacation or her husband's newest business venture. I was 28 years old, and I had become the family's greatest source of shame. It hadn't always been this way. Growing up, I had been the curious one, the daughter who took apart every electronic device in the house just to see how it worked. While Vivian spent her teenage years perfecting her makeup routine and dating the most popular boys in school, I was in my bedroom, hunched over a computer that I had built from spare parts, learning programming languages that most adults had never heard of. My parents viewed my interests with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. In their traditional Mexican-American household, success for a woman meant marriage, children, and maintaining a beautiful home. My fascination with technology was seen as a phase, something I would outgrow once I found the right man to settle down with. When I announced at 17 that I wanted to study computer science at Arizona State University, the dinner table erupted in an argument that lasted for weeks. Eduardo had worked construction his entire life, building homes with his hands, creating something tangible that people could see and touch. To him, my desire to work with invisible code and digital systems was incomprehensible. Carmen, who had raised two daughters while working as a seamstress, couldn't understand why I would choose a field that she believed was meant for antisocial men who lived in their mother's basements. Vivian, meanwhile, had already secured her place as the family favorite by announcing her engagement to Marcus Wellington III, a third-generation Phoenix real estate mogul whose family owned half the shopping centers in Scottsdale. At 19, she was everything our parents had hoped for in a daughter: beautiful, charming, and completely dependent on a man who could provide for her in the style they believed she deserved. The contrast between us became more pronounced as we entered our 20s. Vivian's wedding was a lavish affair that our parents talked about for months afterward, showing pictures to anyone who would look and basking in the reflected glory of their daughter's successful match. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in cybersecurity and computer forensics, but the celebration dinner was overshadowed by Vivian's announcement that she was pregnant with her first child. When I received my first job offer from a government contractor, working on classified projects that I couldn't discuss with anyone, my family's reaction was lukewarm at best. Eduardo asked if it paid as much as Marcus's latest development deal. Carmen wanted to know if there were any eligible bachelors in my office. Vivian barely looked up from her baby shower planning to acknowledge the news. The work itself was everything I had dreamed of and more. I found myself part of a team of brilliant minds working on cutting-edge cybersecurity protocols that protected critical infrastructure from foreign threats. My specialty became digital forensics, the art of tracing cyber attacks back to their source and building cases that could stand up in federal court. I was good at it, better than good. I was exceptional. But my family saw none of this. They saw a daughter who worked strange hours, who couldn't talk about her job at family dinners, who showed up to gatherings alone while Vivian arrived with her handsome husband and adorable children in tow. When relatives asked what I did for a living, Carmen would wave her hand dismissively and say she worked with computers, as if I spent my days playing solitaire in a cubicle somewhere. The breaking point came during my cousin Miguel's graduation party. The entire extended family had gathered in my aunt's backyard, 3 generations celebrating Miguel's acceptance to medical school. I had driven straight from work, still wearing the conservative business attire that was required for my security clearance, feeling exhausted from a particularly challenging case that had kept me at the office for 16 hours straight. As I made my way through the crowd of relatives, accepting congratulations for Miguel and trying to deflect questions about my own life, I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. Carmen was talking to my Aunt Rosa, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal martyrdom that I knew all too well. "I just don't know where we went wrong with Maxine," she was saying, her hands gesturing dramatically as she spoke. "Vivian turned out so well, married to such a good man, giving us beautiful grandchildren. But Maxine, she's 28 and still single, working at some job she can't even talk about. I worry she's going to end up one of those career women who dies alone with her cats." Aunt Rosa made sympathetic noises, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. Our family had always been tightly knit, everyone knowing everyone else's business, and my secretive job had been a source of speculation for years. "What exactly does she do?" Rosa asked, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Carmen sighed heavily. "Something with computers. She says it's classified, but honestly, I think she just doesn't want to admit that she's basically a secretary. You know how these government jobs are. They make everything sound more important than it is." The words hit me like a physical blow. A secretary? After 6 years of college, after countless nights studying cryptography and network security, after earning certifications that less than 1% of people in my field ever achieved, my own mother thought I was a secretary who was too ashamed to admit it? I stood there in the shadow of the patio awning, watching my mother dismiss my entire career with a wave of her hand, and I felt something inside me break. Not shatter dramatically, but crack quietly, like ice beginning to give way under pressure. Eduardo joined the conversation, beer in hand, his voice carrying the same tone of disappointment that I had heard directed at me for years. "The problem is, she thinks she's too good for the boys from the neighborhood. She's got all these fancy degrees, but what good are they if she can't find a husband? Look at Vivian, she knew what was important. Family, children, stability. That's what makes a woman successful." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them about the ransomware attack I had helped prevent just last week, how my analysis had saved a power grid that served 3 million people. I wanted to explain that my computer work had earned me recognition from the FBI, that foreign intelligence agencies considered me enough of a threat that my identity was classified. I wanted them to understand that while they saw failure, I was living a life of purpose and achievement that they couldn't even comprehend. But I couldn't say any of those things. My security clearance meant that the most important parts of my life had to remain secret, even from family. So I stood there in silence, listening to the people who were supposed to love and support me tear apart the person I had worked so hard to become. Vivian appeared at my side, her toddler balanced on her hip, her smile bright and perfectly lipsticked. "There you are, Max. Mom's been looking for you."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She glanced around the party with satisfaction. "Isn't this nice? I love when the whole family gets together like this." I looked at my sister, this woman who had never worked a day in her life, who spent her afternoons at the country club and her evenings planning charity galas where she could be photographed in designer gowns. She was genuinely happy, genuinely content with a life that would have felt like a prison sentence to me, and our family celebrated her choices while viewing mine as a series of mistakes. "Vivian," I said carefully, "do you know what I do for work?" She laughed, the sound light and musical. "Something with computers, right? Marcus says all that tech stuff is too complicated for normal people to understand. That's why he sticks to real estate. You can actually see what you're building." Even my own sister, the person who had shared a bedroom with me for 18 years, who had watched me code my first program and seen me graduate at the top of my class, had reduced my career to something with computers. The rest of the party passed in a blur of forced smiles and deflected questions. I watched Vivian pose for photos with her children, saw my parents beam with pride as relatives praised their successful daughter and adorable grandchildren. When people asked about me, the conversation quickly shifted to other topics, as if my presence was something to be politely overlooked rather than celebrated. Driving home that night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of being invisible, tired of having my achievements dismissed because they didn't fit into my family's narrow definition of success. If they wanted to believe I was just another government secretary pushing papers in a cubicle, then that's exactly what I would let them believe. But I was also tired of protecting them from the truth. The opportunity came 3 months later, in the form of an elegant cream-colored invitation that arrived at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. The Department of Defense was hosting its annual recognition dinner, an event where military leadership honored civilian contractors who had made significant contributions to national security. My name was on the guest list, along with an invitation to bring family members to share in the celebration. I stared at the invitation for a long time, weighing my options. I could attend alone, as I had done for the past 3 years, accepting my commendation in the quiet anonymity that my security clearance required. Or I could invite my family, knowing that they would attend out of curiosity rather than pride, expecting to sit through a boring evening of government bureaucracy. The decision was easier than I thought it would be. I called Carmen that evening, interrupting her nightly telenovela, to extend the invitation. "There's a dinner next month," I said, keeping my voice casual. "A work thing. They're recognizing some of the people in my department, and employees can bring family members." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear her calculating the social implications. A government dinner meant other families would be there, people she could talk to, an opportunity to be seen supporting her daughter, even if she didn't understand what that support was for. "Will there be important people there?" she asked, and I had to suppress a laugh. "Yes, Mom, important people." "And you think we should come, all of us?" "I think it would be nice to have family there," I said, which was not exactly a lie. Carmen agreed immediately, already planning what she would wear and how she would explain my mysterious job to the other attendees. Within an hour, she had called back to confirm that Eduardo, Vivian, and Marcus would also be attending. Apparently, Marcus was particularly interested in the networking opportunities that might arise from rubbing shoulders with government officials. The weeks leading up to the dinner were filled with increasingly pointed questions about what exactly would be happening at this event. Carmen wanted to know if there would be dancing, if the food would be formal, if she should bring a gift. Eduardo asked if there would be alcohol and how long the speeches would last. Vivian was concerned about the dress code and whether the event would be sophisticated enough for Marcus's social circle. I answered their questions as vaguely as possible, allowing them to build their own expectations about what would surely be a modest affair, recognizing minor government employees for routine achievements. Let them imagine a small dinner in a hotel conference room, a few brief speeches from middle management, a generic plaque thanking me for my service. The reality would be somewhat different. As the date approached, I found myself swinging between anticipation and dread. Part of me was genuinely excited to finally share this part of my life with my family, to show them that their assumptions about my career had been catastrophically wrong. But another part of me worried about their reaction, about whether this revelation would bring us closer together or drive an even deeper wedge between us. The night before the dinner, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my apartment, thinking about all the times I had bitten my tongue, all the dismissive comments I had endured, all the achievements I had been forced to keep secret. Tomorrow, those secrets would finally see the light, and my family would have to confront the reality of who I actually was. I thought about Vivian, so secure in her role as the family success story, and wondered how she would react to discovering that her computer secretary sister had been living a parallel life of recognition and achievement. I thought about my parents, so convinced that my choices had been a series of disappointments, and tried to imagine their faces when they realized how wrong they had been. Most of all, I thought about that conversation at Miguel's graduation party. about my mother's certainty that I was just a secretary, too embarrassed to admit the truth about my mundane job. By tomorrow night, she would know exactly what the truth looked like, and it would be nothing like what she expected. The morning of the dinner arrived gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. I spent the day at work trying to focus on a particularly complex case involving a suspected state-sponsored hacking attempt, but my mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. My colleagues, who knew about my family situation, offered words of encouragement and warnings about managing expectations. Just remember, my supervisor Janet told me as I prepared to leave early, they might not react the way you hope they will. Some people find it easier to dismiss achievements they don't understand than to admit they were wrong about someone. I nodded, knowing she was right, but hoping she was wrong. As I drove home to change into my formal attire, I told myself that this dinner would finally bridge the gap between my professional life and my personal one, that my family would finally see me for who I really was. By 6 o'clock, I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my black cocktail dress and trying to calm the butterflies that had taken up residence in my stomach. The dress was conservative, but elegant, appropriate for an evening where I would be representing not just myself, but the entire cybersecurity division of my agency. My phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "On our way. Mom's been talking about this all week. She's convinced you're getting some kind of customer service award." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, something like that. The venue was the Scottsdale Resort and Conference Center, a sprawling complex of adobe buildings nestled in the desert foothills north of Phoenix. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see other guests arriving, men in military dress uniforms and women in elegant evening wear, the kind of crowd that suggested this was not going to be the modest affair my family was expecting. I spotted my family immediately, clustered near the entrance, looking somewhat out of place among the sea of military personnel and government officials. Carmen was wearing her best dress, a navy blue ensemble she had purchased for Vivian's wedding, while Eduardo had donned the one suit he owned, a charcoal gray number that came out for funerals and other solemn occasions. Vivian and Marcus looked more comfortable, their country club attire fitting seamlessly into the upscale atmosphere, though I could see Marcus scanning the crowd with the calculating expression of someone looking for business opportunities. "Maxine!" Carmen called out as I approached, her voice carrying a note of relief. "We were starting to worry you weren't coming to your own dinner." I hugged her, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with the hairspray she used to keep her silver bob perfectly in place. "Sorry I'm late, work ran long." Eduardo shook my hand formally, the way he did with people he didn't know well, while Vivian air-kissed my cheek to avoid disturbing her makeup. Marcus offered a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Impressive venue," he said, glancing around at the soaring lobby with its Native American art and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the desert. "Your department must have a decent budget for these kinds of events." I was about to respond when the doors to the main ballroom opened, revealing a space that took my breath away despite having seen it before. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in military colors, while enormous screens flanked a stage where American flags hung in perfect formation. The scale of the event was immediately apparent. This was not a departmental dinner, but a major military ceremony. Carmen's eyes widened as we walked into the ballroom, taking in the hundreds of guests, the elaborate decorations, and the obvious importance of the evening. "Maxine," she whispered, "how many people work in your department?" Before I could answer, a young soldier in dress blues approached our group. "Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Sergeant Martinez, your escort for the evening. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your table." The word escort seemed to register with my family simultaneously. In their experience, people only received military escorts at events of significant importance. I could see Eduardo's posture straightening, Carmen's confused expression, and Vivian's growing awareness that this evening might not be what she had expected. Our table was in the front section of the ballroom, close enough to the stage that we could see the details of the military decorations displayed on easels nearby. The other guests at our table introduced themselves with titles that made Marcus's eyes widen. Colonel this, General that, Director of such and such. I watched my family's expressions shift from confusion to dawning realization that they were sitting among some of the most powerful people in the military-industrial complex. "So," said the woman to my left, a pleasant-faced civilian with graying hair. "You must be very proud of Maxine's work. What she accomplished with the Eastern Grid incident was absolutely remarkable." Carmen turned to me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of confusion and something that might have been the beginning of pride. "The Eastern Grid incident?" I opened my mouth to deflect the question, but the woman continued speaking. "Oh, you must know about that. It was all over the classified briefings for months. The way she traced that attack back through 17 different proxy servers and identified the source code signature, it probably saved millions of lives." The color drained from Eduardo's face. In his world, things that saved millions of lives were not accomplished by daughters who worked something with computers. They were accomplished by heroes, by people whose names appeared in history books and whose families spoke of them with reverence. Before anyone could respond, the lights dimmed and a voice over the public address system asked everyone to take their seats for the beginning of the ceremony. I felt my family's eyes on me, felt the weight of questions that couldn't be asked in this setting, felt the tectonic shift beginning in their understanding of who I was and what I did. The opening remarks were delivered by a 3-star general whose name I recognized from congressional testimony about cybersecurity threats. He spoke about the invisible war being fought in digital space, about the men and women who defended American infrastructure from attacks that most citizens would never know had occurred. His words painted a picture of a battlefield where the weapons were lines of code and the victories were measured in disasters prevented rather than territories conquered. As he spoke, I watched my family's faces in the dim light. Carmen sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of growing comprehension. Eduardo leaned forward in his chair, hanging on every word as if trying to decode a language he had never heard before. Vivian kept glancing between the stage and me, her social conditioning warring with the evidence of her own eyes. Marcus, meanwhile, was clearly recalculating everything he thought he knew about his sister-in-law. I could see him processing the implications, understanding that the woman he had dismissed as a government secretary was apparently important enough to warrant a front-row seat at a major military ceremony. The general's remarks concluded with an introduction to the evening's main speaker, a 4-star general whose reputation preceded him into any room he entered. As this man took the stage, every military person in the audience stood at attention, a display of respect that made the importance of the moment unmistakable. I found myself holding my breath as he began to speak, knowing that my name would be mentioned, knowing that in a few minutes my family would finally understand exactly what their disappointment of a daughter had been doing with her life. The moment was coming, the revelation that would change everything between us forever. I thought about all the years of feeling invisible, all the times my achievements had been dismissed or ignored, all the family gatherings where I had been treated as the cautionary tale rather than the success story. Tonight, that narrative would finally be rewritten. But as I sat there in the glittering ballroom, surrounded by military brass and government officials, with my family beside me beginning to grasp the magnitude of what they were witnessing, I realized that vindication might not feel the way I had always imagined it would. The truth, I was about to discover, could be just as complicated as the lies that had preceded it. The 4-star general's voice carried across the ballroom with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. General Harrison Pierce was a legend in military circles, a man whose strategic decisions had shaped American defense policy for the past 2 decades. When he spoke, even seasoned colonels listened with rapt attention. "Tonight," he began, his words measured and deliberate, "we honor those who fight battles that history may never record, who achieve victories that newspapers will never print, who sacrifice recognition so that others may sleep safely in their beds." I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as he continued, knowing that my moment was approaching. Beside me, Carmen sat perfectly still, her fingers worrying the edge of her napkin as she tried to process the gravity of what she was witnessing. Eduardo had stopped drinking his water entirely, his glass suspended halfway to his lips as if he had forgotten it existed. The Cyber Warfare Division has prevented more catastrophic attacks on American soil in the past 5 years than most people will experience in their nightmares, General Pierce continued. These men and women work in shadows, their names classified, their achievements buried in files that will remain sealed for decades to come. Vivian leaned forward slightly, her perfectly styled hair catching the light from the chandeliers as she glanced around the table at the other honorees' families.
For the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand that she might not be the most accomplished person in our family, and the realization was written across her face in expressions of confusion and growing unease. Marcus had abandoned all pretense of casual interest and was studying me with the intensity of a man trying to solve a complex equation. In his world of real estate deals and country club politics, success was measured in visible assets and social connections. The idea that his sister-in-law might possess a form of power and influence that existed entirely outside his sphere of understanding was clearly challenging everything he thought he knew about hierarchy and importance. The first recipient tonight, General Pierce announced, exemplifies the dedication and brilliance that defines our cyber defense capabilities. Her work on Operation Digital Shield prevented what intelligence analysts believe would have been the most devastating infrastructure attack in American history. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her wedding ring catching the light as her fingers pressed against the base of her neck. I could see her mind racing, trying to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the woman being described from the stage. The attack targeted the electrical grid serving the northeastern United States during the peak of winter heating season. The perpetrators had infiltrated systems controlling power distribution for over 40 million Americans.
Their plan was to simultaneously shut down electrical service across 6 states, creating a cascade failure that would have left major cities without power for weeks. Eduardo made a small sound in the back of his throat, something between a gasp and a groan. In his practical, hands-on world, he understood exactly what such a scenario would mean: hospitals without power, families freezing in their homes, cities descending into chaos as basic services collapsed. Through months of painstaking digital forensics work, tracing encrypted communications through dozens of proxy servers, and analyzing millions of lines of code, one analyst identified the attack vector and developed countermeasures that not only prevented the attack, but enabled us to trace it back to its source. The general paused, his eyes scanning the audience before settling on our table. That analyst demonstrated the kind of technical expertise and investigative brilliance that makes her one of the most valuable assets in our national security apparatus. Vivian's champagne glass trembled in her hand, and I watched a drop of golden liquid splash onto the white tablecloth. For 28 years, she had been the family's crown jewel, the daughter whose life choices were held up as the gold standard of success. The possibility that her supposedly failed sister might actually be the family's greatest achievement was clearly rearranging every assumption she had ever made about our respective worth. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Pierce said, his voice rising with ceremonial importance, "I present to you the recipient of the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the highest honor the Department of Defense can bestow upon a non-military person, Maxine Elena Rodriguez." The applause that erupted was thunderous, hundreds of military personnel and government officials rising to their feet in recognition of achievements that my family was hearing about for the first time. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and made my way toward the stage as camera flashes illuminated the ballroom like lightning. Behind me, I could feel my family's shock radiating outward like heat from a furnace. Carmen's hand covered her mouth completely, her eyes wide with what looked like equal parts pride and mortification at how thoroughly she had misunderstood her youngest daughter's life. Eduardo sat frozen in his chair, his face pale as he processed the implications of what he was witnessing. As I climbed the steps to the stage, the weight of the moment settled over me like a cloak. This was vindication beyond anything I had dared to imagine, recognition from the highest levels of government for work that I had been forced to keep secret from the people who mattered most to me. General Pierce shook my hand firmly, his grip conveying respect between equals rather than the patronizing acknowledgement I had grown accustomed to receiving from my family. "Maxine," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only I could hear, "your country owes you a debt it can never fully repay." He handed me a crystal award engraved with my name and the seal of the Department of Defense, then turned back to the microphone. "Ms. Rodriguez's work exemplifies the quiet heroism that protects our nation every single day. Her analysis didn't just prevent a catastrophic attack, it provided intelligence that led to the dismantling of an entire network of cyber terrorists operating from 7 different countries." The applause continued as I returned to my seat, the crystal award heavy in my hands.
As I sat down, I caught sight of my family's faces and felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness wash over me. Carmen was crying openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she stared at me with an expression of wonder, as if she was seeing me for the first time. Eduardo reached over and placed his weathered hand on mine, his calloused fingers trembling slightly. "Mija," he whispered, using the endearment he hadn't called me in years. I had no idea. The ceremony continued with other awards, but I could tell my family wasn't processing any of it. They were too busy grappling with the fundamental reorganization of their understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. Vivian kept glancing at me sideways, her social programming struggling to accommodate the idea that her computer secretary sister had just received one of the highest civilian honors in the country. Marcus, meanwhile, was clearly recalculating my value in the social and professional network he worked so hard to cultivate. The man who had dismissed my career as irrelevant was now sitting next to someone who apparently had the ear of 4-star generals and the gratitude of presidents. When the formal ceremony concluded, the ballroom erupted into the cocktail party atmosphere typical of such events. Military officers mingled with defense contractors, government officials chatted with their families, and the honored civilians found themselves surrounded by well-wishers and colleagues eager to offer congratulations. I expected my family to retreat to a corner somewhere, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had witnessed and uncertain how to navigate this world they knew nothing about. Instead, I found myself watching in fascination as they each processed Deep Evening's revelations in their own way. Carmen approached me first, her makeup slightly smudged from tears, but her posture straighter than I had seen it in years. "Maxine," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "why didn't you tell us? All these years, I thought... "I couldn't tell you, Mom," I said gently. "My security clearance requires that most of my work remain classified. Even tonight, they're only acknowledging a small part of what I actually do." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her mind working backward through years of conversations, reinterpreting every vague answer I had given about my job, every deflected question about my work, every moment when I had been forced to let them believe I was something less than I actually was. "All those times I worried about you," she whispered. "All those times I thought you were throwing your life away, and you were actually saving lives," I finished quietly, "protecting people, serving my country in the way I knew how." Eduardo joined us, his eyes still slightly glazed with shock. "The general," he said slowly, "he said, you're one of the most valuable assets in national security. That means your daughter is a genuine American hero," said a voice behind us. We turned to see a distinguished woman in her 50s approaching our group, her military bearing unmistakable despite her civilian attire. She extended her hand to me with a warm smile. "Colonel Janet Stevens, retired," she said. "I worked with Maxine on the Digital Shield operation. Your daughter's analysis saved my son's life." Carmen's hand flew to her chest. "Your son?" "He was in a Boston hospital when the attack was supposed to happen," Colonel Stevens explained. "Life support, critical condition. If the power grid had gone down when they planned, he wouldn't have survived. Thanks to Maxine's work, he's graduating from college next month." I watched my parents absorb this information, the abstract concept of saving lives suddenly becoming concrete and personal. This wasn't just about national security or military honors, this was about a mother's son who was alive because of work I had done in a windowless office that my family had never bothered to understand. Vivian finally approached, moving with the careful grace of someone who knows they're walking on fundamentally changed ground. "Max," she said, her voice uncertain in a way I had never heard before, "I need to apologize."
We all do. Before I could respond, another voice interrupted. "Excuse me, Miss Rodriguez." We turned to see a young woman in an Air Force dress uniform, her face bright with excitement and nervousness. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chen. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you personally. I'm a cybersecurity analyst at Peterson Air Force Base, and your research on encryption protocols is what got me interested in this field. You're the reason I joined the Air Force." The conversation that followed was surreal in its implications. Lieutenant Chen had read papers I had published in classified journals, had followed career developments that my family knew nothing about, had been inspired by achievements that Carmen and Eduardo had never even known existed. As she spoke about my influence on her career, I watched my parents' faces transform with the growing realization that their daughter wasn't just successful in her field, she was a recognized leader whose work inspired other people to serve their country. When Lieutenant Chen finally moved away, Vivian turned to me with an expression I had never seen on her face before: genuine humility. "Max," she said quietly, "I spent years thinking I was the successful one in our family. I thought my marriage, my house, my lifestyle, that was what success looked like. But what you've done, what you've accomplished," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. But I could see her struggling with the recognition that my quiet, secretive career had been building toward achievements that dwarfed anything she had ever accomplished. Her social status, her wealthy husband, her picture-perfect life suddenly seemed small and insignificant compared to work that had literally saved millions of lives. Marcus, meanwhile, was having his own reckoning. As a businessman, he understood power and influence, and he was beginning to grasp that his sister-in-law possessed both in quantities he had never imagined. The woman he had dismissed as a government secretary was apparently important enough to receive personal thanks from military leadership and to influence national security policy. "Maxine," he said, his tone carefully respectful in a way it had never been before, "I owe you an apology. We all do. I don't think any of us understood." "How could you understand?" I replied, not unkindly. "I wasn't allowed to tell you. But that doesn't excuse how you treated me, how you all treated me. For years, you made me feel like a failure because my success didn't look like what you expected success to look like." Eduardo stepped forward, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. "Mija, I worked construction my whole life. I built houses, shopping centers, office buildings. I could see what I accomplished, touch it with my hands. I didn't understand that there were other ways to build things, other ways to protect people." "You built walls, Dad," I said softly. "I built firewalls. You protected families by giving them safe homes. I protected families by keeping the lights on and the hospitals running. We're not so different." Carmen was crying again, but these were different tears. "All those family dinners," she whispered. "All those times we asked what you did, and you said you couldn't talk about it. We thought you were making excuses, but you were actually keeping state secrets," I finished, "protecting classified information that could affect national security if it fell into the wrong hands." The weight of their misunderstanding settled over them like a heavy blanket. For years, they had interpreted my discretion as evasiveness, my inability to discuss my work as an indication that there wasn't much work to discuss. They had mistaken patriotic duty for professional shame. As the evening progressed, I found myself surrounded by colleagues and military personnel who wanted to congratulate me on the award and share their own stories about how my work had impacted their missions. My family stood nearby, watching with growing amazement as person after person approached to thank me, to share how my analysis had prevented disasters they had never heard of, how my research had saved operations they couldn't have imagined. It was during one of these conversations that the moment occurred which would become family legend, the story that would be retold at every gathering for years to come. I was speaking with a group of Air Force cybersecurity specialists about emerging threats in quantum computing when I became aware of a subtle shift in the energy around me. Conversations gradually died away, military personnel straightened almost imperceptibly, and I felt the presence of someone approaching from behind. I turned to find myself face to face with General William Harrison, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the highest-ranking military officer in the United States. A four-star general whose photograph hung in the Pentagon and whose strategic decisions shaped American military policy around the world. He was a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, wearing a chest full of ribbons and decorations that represented a lifetime of service at the highest levels of military command. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to finally meet you in person. Your reputation precedes you." I shook his hand, acutely aware that every eye in our section of the ballroom was now focused on our interaction. Behind me, I could sense my family watching in stunned silence as the most powerful military leader in the country treated their supposedly unsuccessful daughter as an equal. "General Harrison," I replied. "The honor is entirely mine, sir." He smiled, and I was struck by how it transformed his stern features into something warmer and more approachable. "I wanted to thank you personally for your work on Operation Sentinel Watch. The intelligence you provided allowed us to prevent what could have been a catastrophic breach of our satellite communication systems." I nodded acknowledgement, unsure how to respond to praise from someone whose approval represented the highest possible validation of my career. Operation Sentinel Watch had been one of my most challenging assignments, requiring months of analysis to trace a sophisticated attack on military communication satellites back to its source. "Your analysis was brilliant," he continued. "The way you identified the intrusion vector through seemingly unrelated network anomalies, it was textbook counterintelligence work. We've incorporated your methodology into training programs across all branches of the service." The conversation that followed was professional and brief, but its impact on my family was profound. They watched in amazement as I discussed technical details with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, as he solicited my opinions on emerging cyber threats, as he treated me not as a civilian contractor, but as a valued colleague whose expertise he genuinely respected. When our conversation concluded, General Harrison surprised everyone, including me, by making an unusual request. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have a rather unconventional favor to ask. My daughter is 16 years old, and she's considering a career in cybersecurity. She's read about your work in some of the academic journals, and she's written a school report about women in national security. Would you mind signing this program for her? She'd be thrilled to have an autograph from one of her heroes." The ballroom seemed to freeze around us. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man who commanded the respect of presidents and prime ministers, was asking for my autograph for his daughter. Not as a formality, not as a political courtesy, but because his child genuinely looked up to me as a role model. I took the program and pen with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware that this moment would forever change my family's understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. As I signed my name below the Department of Defense seal, I could hear Carmen's sharp intake of breath behind me. "Tell her," I said as I handed the program back to General Harrison, "that the most important thing about cybersecurity isn't the technology, it's the people you're protecting. Every line of code she writes, every system she secures, every threat she identifies could be the difference between safety and catastrophe for someone's family." He nodded solemnly. "I'll pass that along. She'll treasure this, Miss Rodriguez. Thank you." As General Harrison moved away, the spell that had held our section of the ballroom in suspended animation broke. Conversations resumed, people began moving again, and the normal rhythm of the reception reasserted itself. But for my family, nothing would ever be normal again. I turned to face them, and the expressions on their faces told me everything I needed to know about how profoundly this evening had changed their perception of me. Carmen looked as if she had just witnessed a miracle, her eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been the beginning of genuine respect. Eduardo stood perfectly still, his face pale with the realization of how completely he had misunderstood his youngest daughter's life and career. Vivian was perhaps the most affected. For the first time in her life, she was confronting the possibility that her sister might actually be more accomplished, more important, more genuinely successful than she was. The woman who had built her identity around being the family's golden child was discovering that the sister she had patronized and dismissed was actually the sister that four-star generals admired and whose work inspired young people to serve their country. Marcus, ever the businessman, was clearly recalculating everything he thought he knew about power and influence. The woman he had dismissed as a government secretary had just received personal thanks from the highest levels of military leadership and had been asked for her autograph by someone whose strategic decisions shaped American defense policy. But it was Carmen's reaction that affected me most deeply. My mother, who had spent years worrying that I would end up alone and unsuccessful, who had dismissed my career as something with computers, who had compared me unfavorably to Vivian at every opportunity, was now staring at me as if she was seeing me for the first time. "Maxine," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the reception. "I don't understand. How is this possible? How did you become this person without us knowing?"
The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications about the distance that had grown between us over the years, about the assumptions they had missed and the reality they had missed. It was a question that demanded an honest answer, one that would require me to explain not just what I had accomplished, but why I had been forced to accomplish it in silence. "I became this person," I said quietly, "because you taught me that I had to prove my worth. Because you made it clear that my value would be measured by my achievements, not by your love. Because I learned that if I wanted respect, I would have to earn it through excellence." The words were harsh but true, and I watched them land on my family like physical blows. They had created the very person they had failed to recognize, had pushed me toward achievements they couldn't acknowledge because they were too busy celebrating a different kind of success. "But we never knew," Eduardo protested. "You never told us." "I tried to tell you," I replied. "Every time you asked what I did for work, every time you wondered why I couldn't discuss my job, every time I tried to explain that my work was important, you chose not to hear me because what I was saying didn't fit the story you wanted to tell about my life." The reception continued around us, but we might as well have been alone in the ballroom. This conversation, this reckoning, had been years in the making, and it would reshape our family dynamics forever. Vivian stepped forward, her voice small and uncertain. "Max, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Are you happy? Really happy? Because I've been watching you tonight, seeing how people treat you, how much respect you command, and I'm starting to wonder if everything I thought I knew about success and happiness was wrong." It was perhaps the most honest question she had ever asked me, and it deserved an honest answer. "Yes," I said simply, "I'm happy. I wake up every morning knowing that my work matters, that I'm protecting people, that I'm serving something larger than myself. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, proud of the difference I've made. For the first time in my life, I don't need anyone else's approval to know that I'm successful." The implications of that statement settled over them slowly. I had found fulfillment and purpose in a life they had viewed as a series of disappointments. I had achieved recognition and respect in a world they didn't understand. Most importantly, I had stopped needing their approval to feel valuable, which meant that their opinions no longer had the power to diminish me. As the evening wound down and we prepared to leave the ballroom, I realized that this dinner had accomplished something I had never intended. I had invited my family hoping to finally share my achievements with them, to bridge the gap between my professional and personal lives. Instead, I had shown them that the gap was unbridgeable, that I had grown into someone they couldn't fully understand or appreciate, and that I no longer needed them to. The daughter who had left for the dinner that evening, still seeking their approval and validation, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own worth, who commanded respect from the highest levels of government, and who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The transformation was complete, but its consequences were just beginning. The drive home from the reception was conducted in absolute silence, the kind of quiet that fills a car when everyone is afraid to say the wrong thing. I followed my family's sedan through the winding desert roads, watching their silhouettes in the dim glow of their dashboard lights, knowing that each of them was processing the evening's revelations in their own way. When we reached my parents' house, the same modest ranch-style home where I had grown up feeling invisible, Carmen turned in the driveway and gestured for me to follow them inside. For the first time in years, I wasn't being dismissed at the end of a family gathering.
Instead, they seemed desperate to continue a conversation that none of them knew how to begin. The living room felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with the same furniture that had witnessed countless family discussions where my voice had been marginalized or ignored entirely. Tonight, however, the dynamic was fundamentally different. As we settled into the familiar seating arrangement, I realized that I was no longer the family member seeking acceptance. I was the one whose approval they now needed. Eduardo sat heavily in his recliner, the crystal award I had carried in from the car catching the lamplight as I placed it on the coffee table between us. The Department of Defense seal etched into its surface seemed to transform the entire room, a tangible reminder that their understanding of their youngest daughter had been catastrophically incomplete. "I keep thinking about the general," Carmen said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched for several uncomfortable minutes. "The way he spoke to you, the way he asked for your autograph, I've never seen anything like that in my entire life." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap as she struggled to articulate thoughts that challenged everything she had believed about success and recognition. When Vivian got married, I thought that was the proudest moment of my life. Watching her walk down the aisle in that beautiful dress, knowing she was going to have the life I always wanted for her. But tonight? The sentence hung unfinished in the air, but I could see the internal conflict playing out across her features. Carmen had spent decades defining maternal success through her daughter's adherence to traditional expectations. Vivian's marriage to Marcus had validated her approach to parenting, confirming that the path she had encouraged was the right one. My career, by contrast, had seemed like a rejection of everything she valued. Now she was confronting the possibility that she had been wrong about everything, that the daughter she had worried about was actually the daughter she should have been celebrating all along. Vivian spoke next, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. Max, I need to understand something. All those years when we asked what you did for work, when you said it was classified, were you actually protecting state secrets, like real government secrets that could affect national security? I nodded, watching her absorb the implications of that confirmation. For someone whose biggest secret was the cost of her weekly manicures, the idea that her sister had been entrusted with information that could impact millions of lives was clearly overwhelming. Every project I work on requires security clearance that most people will never qualify for, I explained. The background investigations alone take months. They interview neighbors, colleagues, former teachers. They review financial records, social media activity, travel history. They're looking for any indication that someone might be vulnerable to blackmail or coercion by foreign agents. Marcus leaned forward, his businessman's instincts finally beginning to grasp the magnitude of what he was learning. That level of security clearance, that suggests you have access to information that affects military strategy, diplomatic relations, economic policy. Among other things, I confirmed. Jesus Christ, he whispered, and I saw Carmen flinch at the profanity. Maxine, do you understand what this means? The level of trust the government has placed in you? The responsibility? I looked at him steadily. Marcus, I've understood exactly what it means for the past 8 years. The question is whether you understand what it means about the assumptions you've made about my life and career. The pointed nature of my response wasn't lost on him. For years, he had dismissed me as an unsuccessful government employee, someone whose career was so unremarkable that it wasn't worth understanding. Now he was confronting the reality that I held a position of trust and responsibility that dwarfed anything in his professional experience. Eduardo cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncertain. Mija, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. When you were growing up, when you were studying all that computer stuff, did you know this was where it would lead? Did you know you would become this important? It was a fair question, and one that required me to think back to my younger self, to remember the girl who had taught herself programming languages in her bedroom while her sister practiced cheerleading routines in the backyard. I knew I wanted to do something that mattered, I said carefully. I knew I was good with technology, that I understood systems and patterns in ways that other people didn't. I also knew that there were threats out there, people trying to use technology to hurt Americans, and I wanted to be part of stopping them. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. What I didn't know was how it would feel to serve my country while my own family treated my service like a disappointment. I didn't know how isolating it would be to have achievements I couldn't share, recognition I couldn't discuss, pride I had to keep to myself. The words hit them like physical blows, and I watched guilt wash over their faces as they began to understand the emotional cost of their dismissal and misunderstanding. Carmen started crying again, but these tears were different from the ones she had shed at the reception. These were tears of regret, of maternal guilt, of recognition that she had failed her daughter in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. "We failed you," she whispered. "All these years, we failed you completely." "You didn't fail me," I corrected gently. "You misunderstood me. You made assumptions about what my life should look like instead of trying to understand what my life actually was. But I succeeded anyway,
And I succeeded because I learned not to need your approval to know my own worth. Vivian was staring at the crystal award as if it held the answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. Max, all those family dinners where we talked about success, where Mom and Dad praised my marriage and my lifestyle, were you sitting there knowing that you had accomplished things that made our achievements look small? The question was perceptive in a way that surprised me. Vivian had always been intelligent, but her intelligence had been channeled into social navigation rather than professional achievement. Now she was beginning to apply that intelligence to understanding how profoundly the family narrative had been skewed. I was sitting there knowing that I had chosen a different path, I said. Not necessarily a better path, just different. But yes, there were times when I listened to conversations about success and recognition and wanted to say that I had achieved both, just not in ways that our family understood or valued. Marcus was shaking his head slowly, his face pale with the implications of what he was learning. Maxine, I owe you an apology that goes beyond anything I can put into words. I dismissed you. I marginalized you. I treated you like you were somehow less successful than Vivian because your achievements didn't fit into categories I understood. He paused, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration and regret.
Do you know what's really killing me? I spend my days networking, trying to build relationships with people who have influence and power. And the whole time, I had a sister-in-law who commands respect from four-star generals, whose work influences national security policy, whose expertise is valued at the highest levels of government. I was so busy looking down on you that I never realized I should have been looking up to you. The admission was more honest than I had expected from Marcus, and it revealed something about him that I hadn't seen before. Beneath his social climbing and business maneuvering was someone who genuinely understood power when he finally recognized it. Eduardo stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the dark street as if the answers to his questions might be written in the shadows. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Maxine, I spent 40 years building houses, and I was proud of that work. I could drive through Phoenix and point to buildings I had helped construct, neighborhoods where families lived safely because of foundations I had helped pour. I thought that was the only way to serve people, to protect them. I thought your computer work was just playing around. He turned back to face me, and I could see tears in his eyes. Tonight, I learned that while I was building walls to keep individual families safe, you were building barriers to keep the entire country safe. I learned that my daughter is protecting millions of people I will never meet, preventing disasters I can't even imagine. And I also learned that I've been too stupid and too stubborn to see it. The raw honesty in his voice broke something open in my chest, a wall I had built around the hurt of never feeling valued by the man whose approval I had craved throughout my childhood. For the first time in years, I felt like he was actually seeing me, actually understanding who I had become. Dad, I said softly, we were both serving people. We were both protecting families. We were both building things that mattered. The difference is that you were able to share your pride in your work with your family, and I wasn't. Carmen stood up and walked over to where I was sitting, her movements uncertain, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to comfort the daughter she had so thoroughly misunderstood. When she reached out and touched my hand, her fingers were trembling. "How do we fix this?" she asked. "How do we make up for all the years we got it wrong? How do we learn to be the family you deserve to have?" It was the question I had been waiting for someone to ask for 8 years, and now that it had finally been posed, I realized I wasn't sure I had an answer. The damage that had been done wasn't something that could be repaired with apologies and good intentions. Years of feeling invisible, of having my achievements dismissed, of being treated as the family disappointment had fundamentally changed who I was and how I related to them. "I don't know if you can fix it," I said honestly. "I don't know if I want you to try. What I know is that I've built a life that doesn't require your understanding or approval. I have colleagues who respect my work, friends who value my contributions, a career that gives me purpose and satisfaction. I've learned to find validation from sources that actually understand what I do and why it matters." The words were harsh but necessary.
They needed to understand that the evening's revelations didn't automatically restore relationships that had been damaged by years of neglect and misunderstanding. Recognition of my achievements didn't erase the hurt of having those achievements dismissed for so long. Vivian surprised me by speaking next, her voice steady despite the tears that had been flowing intermittently throughout our conversation. Max, I don't want you to forgive us. I don't think we deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that everything about how I understand success and achievement and family has changed tonight. She paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. I've spent my entire adult life feeling superior to you, feeling like I had chosen the right path while you had somehow lost your way. I built my identity around being the daughter who made our parents proud, the sister who had her life together, the woman who understood what really mattered. Her voice broke slightly as she continued. But tonight, I realized that while I was playing house and planning charity luncheons, you were literally saving lives. While I was focused on impressing people at the country club, you were earning the respect of people who shape American defense policy. While I was measuring my worth by my husband's success and my children's accomplishments, you were building your own legacy of service and achievement. The admission was more profound than anything I had expected from Vivian, and it revealed a depth of self-reflection that I hadn't known she possessed. For the first time in our relationship, she was acknowledging not just that I had succeeded, but that her own definition of success might have been fundamentally flawed. I want to learn, she said quietly. I want to understand what you do, why it matters, how you became the person you are. Not because I think it will fix anything between us, but because I think understanding you might help me understand what I want to teach my own children about achievement and service and making a difference in the world. Marcus nodded his agreement. Maxine, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but I would be grateful for the chance to learn from you. Not just about cybersecurity or government work, but about finding purpose in your career, about measuring success by impact rather than income, about building something that matters more than personal profit. I looked around the room at my family, these people who had shaped my childhood and disappointed my adulthood, who had pushed me to achieve while refusing to acknowledge my achievements, who had loved me conditionally while I learned to love myself completely. I'll think about it, I said finally, but I need you to understand that any relationship we build going forward will be different from what we had before. It will be based on who I actually am, not on who you want me to be. It will require you to respect choices you don't understand and achievements you can't measure by your own standards. Eduardo came back from the window and sat down heavily, looking older than I had ever seen him. Mija, what do your colleagues call you? At work, I mean. What's your title? The question seemed random, but I could see he was struggling to understand the practical details of a career that remained largely abstract to him. Senior cybersecurity analyst, I replied, though on some projects I function as a team leader or principal investigator. And the people you work with, they respect you? They value your opinions? I nodded. In my field, respect is earned through competence and results.
My colleagues trust my analysis because I've consistently provided accurate intelligence that has prevented attacks and protected critical infrastructure. My supervisors value my work because I've developed methodologies that have improved our defensive capabilities. So you're not just successful, Carmen said slowly, working through the implications. You're recognized as being exceptional at what you do. Yes. The simple confirmation seemed to hit them harder than all the military honors and four-star general recognition combined. This wasn't just about one evening of acknowledgement. This was about a sustained career of excellence that they had never recognized or celebrated. The conversation continued for another hour, but the fundamental shift in our family dynamics was already complete. They were no longer the disappointed parents and successful sister who tolerated my presence at family gatherings. I was no longer the underachieving daughter seeking their approval and validation. Instead, we were adults renegotiating relationships based on a completely different understanding of who we each were and what we had accomplished. The process would be long and difficult, requiring them to abandon assumptions they had held for years, and me to decide whether I wanted to invest in relationships that had caused me so much pain. As I prepared to leave that night, Carmen walked me to the door with the Crystal Award in her hands, studying it as if it might provide answers to questions she was still learning to ask. "Maxine," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I'm going to learn about what you do. I'm going to read articles, research cybersecurity, try to understand the world you work in. Not because I think it will change anything between us, but because I need to know who my daughter really is." I hugged her goodbye, feeling the weight of years of misunderstanding beginning to shift between us. "Mom, I'd like that, but I need you to know that understanding my work isn't the same as understanding me. I'm more than my career, just like you're more than a seamstress and Dad's more than a construction worker." She nodded, tears starting again. "I know, but maybe understanding your work will help me start to understand why we lost you somewhere along the way." Driving home to my apartment that night, I reflected on the unexpected turn my plan for vindication had taken. I had invited my family to the reception, hoping to finally share my achievements with them, to prove that their dismissal of my career had been wrong. What I had accomplished instead was proving to myself that I no longer needed their approval to know my own worth. The recognition from General Harrison, the respect of my colleagues, the satisfaction of work that made a genuine difference in the world, these things belonged to me, regardless of whether my family understood or appreciated them. Their newfound awareness of my achievements didn't validate me. I had already validated myself through years of excellent work and dedicated service. 3 weeks later, Carmen called me at work, something she had never done before. When I answered, her voice was excited in a way I hadn't heard since Vivian's wedding planning. "Maxine, I've been reading about cybersecurity attacks, and there was an article in the newspaper about hackers trying to shut down hospitals. It said that government analysts prevented the attack, and I couldn't help wondering if that was the kind of work you do." I smiled despite myself. "That's exactly the kind of work I do, Mom." The article said that whoever stopped the attack saved hundreds of lives, maybe thousands. Is that true? "It's true." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Carmen spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "My daughter saves lives." "Yes, Mom, your daughter saves lives." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a return to the family dynamics we had known before, but it was a beginning, a tentative step toward relationships based on truth rather than assumptions, on respect rather than conditional approval. 6 months later, Vivian called to tell me that she had enrolled in community college computer science classes, wanting to understand the field that had shaped her sister's life. Marcus had started volunteering with a nonprofit that provided cybersecurity training to small businesses, inspired by what he had learned about the importance of digital security. Eduardo surprised me most of all by visiting my office one afternoon, asking for a tour of the facility where his daughter worked. As I showed him the secure computer labs and explained the work we did there, I watched his face transform with understanding and pride. "Mija," he said as we stood in front of a wall display showing successful threat interventions, "I always knew you were smart. I just never knew you were a hero." My family's newfound respect and understanding felt good, but it felt different from the vindication I had expected. It wasn't the triumphant moment of recognition I had imagined. It was quieter, more complex, tinged with sadness for the years we had lost to misunderstanding. What mattered more was the realization that I had built a life of meaning and achievement independent of their approval. The woman who had been dismissed as a disappointment had become someone whose work protected millions of people, whose expertise was valued by military leadership, whose career inspired others to serve their country. The girl who had felt invisible in her own family had grown into a woman who was seen and respected by people who understood what she had accomplished. And that transformation was complete whether my family ever understood it or not. A year after the recognition dinner, I received another invitation, this time to speak at a conference for young women considering careers in cybersecurity. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of bright, ambitious students, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had started as a daughter seeking approval from a family that couldn't understand her choices. I had become a woman whose choices protect families she would never meet, whose work prevented disasters that would never make headlines,
whose service to her country required her to remain invisible to the very people she was protecting. It was a life I had chosen, a path I had walked alone, a purpose I had discovered for myself. And it was enough. When the conference ended, a young Latina student approached me, her eyes bright with excitement and determination. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said, "your speech inspired me. I want to do what you do. I want to protect people through technology." I looked at her eager face and saw myself at that age, hungry for purpose and recognition, ready to prove that I belonged in a world that hadn't been designed for people like us. "Then do it," I told her, "and remember that the most important recognition you'll ever receive is the satisfaction of knowing that your work matters, that you're making a difference, that you're serving something larger than yourself." She nodded solemnly, and I knew she understood. Some victories are public, celebrated with crystal awards and applause from four-star generals. But the victories that matter most are private, measured not by recognition, but by lives saved, disasters prevented, and purposes fulfilled. My family eventually learned to see me for who I was, but by then, I had already learned to see myself. And that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.